Hi, everybody. We're going to just give a moment for everyone to get into this virtual room. While we wait for that, I hope that everybody is looking forward to next week. I myself am taking some time off, and then Thanksgiving is right there in the middle of it. If you care to introduce yourself or what you're thinking of doing next week, I'm happy to have some chat going on in the chat room. I still see that people are still coming in quickly here. It's kind of exciting, in fact, that there's quite so many people here. All right, I think we'll just go ahead and kick it off. And welcome everyone to Diversity and Race Data, What Census Changes Mean for Policymakers. I'm Wendy Underhill. I'm NCSL's Director of Elections and Redistricting. But today I'm wearing my Census Geek hat, and I'm also wearing my Census pin. Whenever I'm talking about it, I always try to have that on for good luck. I'm joined by three other very experienced people. We might be able to call them census geeks too, but we'll let them self-identify. Each has their own angle on our topic today. And as for all of you who are joining us, I really don't know what your interests are. I know some of you are coming from the redistricting angle, but I think a lot of you are coming from a different perspective. But the fact that we had over 400 people register for this tells me that there's a need out there in the policy world for more information on the census, and particularly on how it provides data on America's racial and ethnic diversity. So thank you all for joining us today, and please, as best you can, be part of this conversation. Go ahead and put your questions in the chat box, and also your thoughts if you just got something you'd like to share with us. As for our presentation, let's just go straight into it. I'm going to introduce each of our three experts one by one. And we're going to hear first from Nicholas Jones. And Nicholas is the Director and Senior Advisor on Race and Ethnic Research and Outreach for the Census Bureau's Population Division. And what I can add from my own experience is that Nicholas is easy to work with and fun to listen to. Nicholas, as you take it over, please do give us a fun fact about yourself.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Do you mind, Wendy? I think Matt was actually going to go first, but I'm happy to share my fun fact, or I can save my fun fact for my part of the presentation. Matt, is that still right?
So clearly, even though we had a conversation earlier today, I screwed it up. Let's hold Matt with your fun fact and go with, let's hold Nicholas with your fun fact and go with you, Matt. We're going to put your bio into the chat so other folks can see who you are. From my perspective, I know that you're a sociologist at Stanford. And for us today, the most important thing is that you have served on many advisory committees for the Census Bureau. And in particular, you've served on the Racial and Ethnic Advisory Committee. And I know you and appreciate the work that you do because we both serve on the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine Census Data Quality Control Data Quality Committee this decade. So my apologies, Matt, it's yours. Go ahead and give us a fun fact.
Well, thanks, Wendy. Yeah, that might be the hardest question anybody's asked me this week. But one fun fact is that I'm a Oklahoma, Cherokee, and Choctaw. And in addition to that, I'm also an avid sailor and have been for about 35 years. So that's my fun fact. And would you like me to take it away? Yes,
but I want to point out that that was two fun facts. So the next time somebody asks you, you can say you've got more than one ready to go.
Great, happy to share. So I'm going to begin by sharing my screen here, and hopefully, fingers crossed, things come up as they should. So I'm going to provide some background information, and I think Nicholas is going to speak about understanding the data as it exists as of 2020. But the information that I want to share with you is really to kind of explain to you how we got to where we are today. And to do that, we have to go all the way back to the very first census of the United States, taken shortly after the ratification of the Constitution. And in the Constitution, there is this language in Article 1, Section 2, about the necessity of taking a census every 10 years. and that it should include the following designations. It should include a count of 3 persons that excluded Indians not taxed, and then 3/5 of all other persons, which of course is sort of known as the sort of notorious 3/5 compromise, which took place during the Constitutional Convention. And this was eventually amended in the, I believe it was the 14th Amendment. 1800 and 1810 censuses were very much like the 1790 census. 1820 was notable because the term color was added to the enumeration schedule. And in this period, basically the way the census was taken was that you had federal marshals riding on horseback, crisscrossing, the territory they were assigned, and then stopping and enumerating individuals as they could find them. And this was basically the process that was used until the late, I believe it was the late 19th century, when the federal marshals were no longer responsible for taking the census. 1850, we're sort of now in the sort of the throes of the controversy over slavery and an impending civil war. And the census responded to this by collecting information about color and civil condition, that is, whether or not African Americans were free or slave. And then the other item that was notable is that they added a mulatto category. And this is significant because by 1850, there were a sufficient number of mixed race persons in this country that the Census Bureau felt obliged to try to count them. 1860, we began to see a large influx of Chinese workers, which for many Americans was a very alarming development. And so the Census Bureau added a category to identify how many Chinese had entered the country. 1870, you had a similar alarm and concern about the numbers of Japanese arriving in California. So there was a category added for the California enumeration for Japanese. And even though the Civil War and the 14th and 15th Amendments had, in a sense, said that race and color should not be a consideration for citizenship, by the late 19th century, the pseudosciences of ethnology and eugenics were at their apex in American Academy, particularly scientific research and scientists were persuaded that race was an important thing to study and to track and monitor. And so in 1890, there were categories for quadroon and octoroon were added. And there was an instruction to enumerators that that they should take special care to enumerate quadroons and octoroons and mulattoes because special scientific results depended upon it, though they never described what those results might be. The American Indian population by 1890 had been pretty much confined to reservations. The population was declining very dramatically, and it was expected that American Indians would eventually become extinct in the 20th century. And so there was a special effort to record American Indian culture in the 1890 census. By 1900, the octoroon and quadroon categories were deleted. And by 1930, categories for Mexicans, Filipinos, Hindus, Koreans were added in recognition of growing numbers of these immigrants coming to the country, mostly as farm labor in the West and Southwest. The one-drop rule, that is anyone who has any American or African-American ancestry, anyone who has one drop is African-American by default, meant that the mulatto category was redundant and it was deleted from the 1930 census. 1940, the Mexican category was deleted as a result of lobbying by the government of Mexico, as well as, I believe it was LULAC, which was a Mexican American advocacy organization. They didn't want to be recognized as non-white, and they objected to the Mexican category. 1960, we had a huge change in the census. and that the census introduced a mail-out, mail-back questionnaire. And this was very, very important for understanding how race is classified and measured in this country, because in prior censuses before 1960, race was assigned on the basis of enumerator observation. And so enumerator went to a house, knocked on the door, somebody would answer the door, and the enumerator made a judgment about whether they were white, black, or American Indian, or some other race. And then that designation held for the entire household. So there was always a presumption of racial homogeneity when the enumerators were doing the observing and recording of race. The change in 1960 meant that it was no longer based on sort of the visual acuity of enumerators, but it was really based on how people identified themselves, who they believed themselves to be. So it was based on a subjective understanding of race and racial heritage. And this actually resulted in a very dramatic increase in the American Indian population. 1980, the Hispanic origin was question was added. There's a long story behind that, but I could probably answer question and answer if you want to hear about that. And then in 2000 and beyond, what we saw was a set of new categories and new instructions. So around 1977, the federal government, many agencies within the federal government, as a result of various laws and civil rights legislation, were responsible for collecting information about race. And there was no absolute standard for collecting race. And so different agencies collected information using different classifications. And so in 1977, the Office of Management and Budget issued something called Directive Number 15, which said that for federal agencies, their contractors and grantees, they should use this classification for collecting information about race. And this became the sort of the first federal benchmark for how we're supposed to collect race, even though the Census Bureau had been doing something similar for a number of previous censuses. And so this Directive 15 was implemented in the 1980 and 1990 census. And the 1990 census in particular was a turning point in the OMB classification. You can see the question, or a facsimile to the question here, up there in number 4. It says, is this person, and they didn't even use the term race, but they figured people would know what they were meaning. And it said, fill one circle. And if you filled more than one circle, the Census Bureau took their electronic eraser and erased the additional responses. And there was a very complicated set of rules for how they did that. And then there was also the Hispanic origin question, which appeared several questions later. And there was a problem there because people would fill in question 4 and then they would get down to question 7. Then they would say, well, why do we have to do this? And then they would just skip it. So after the 1990 census, there was a lot of disquiet and unhappiness from omitted groups. There were interracial family organizations who objected to the instruction that you could only check 1. And this led to a series of congressional inquiries, starting with one launched by Tom Sawyer, Democrat of Ohio. So these congressional hearings, there were hearings in 1993. This led to a National Academy of Science conference in 1994. The Office of Management and Budget held hearings around the country. There was an interagency working group, I think, of representatives from, 28 different agencies. And the Census Bureau also ran a series of tests in a special survey they did called the Race and Ethnicity Targeted Test, but they also included tests in the national contest and then also a supplement of the current population survey. And so in October 30 of 1997, there was a revised standard, which was supposed to be adopted by all agencies, grantees, and contractors by January 1 of 2003. And it included modified categories and modified instructions. The modified categories included the previous ones, but there was an addition that Asian was broken up into Asian and then also Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islanders. That was the major change in categories. And they continued to maintain the designation that Hispanic should be considered of any race and that it was a category of ethnicity. But the really important change, I think anyway, was the change in instructions that allowed individuals to select one or more races. And so this is a mock-up of the 2000 census question. As you can see, there is the instruction telling people to answer both questions about Hispanic origins as well as their race. And it says mark one or more races. This was the first implementation of the OMB revised standard. And then that was continued in the 2010 census, but only with the addition of some examples for Asians and also for other Pacific Islanders. And so there were a number of issues that came up in the 2000 and 2010 censuses that continue to remain unresolved in 2020. For example, it turns out that many Hispanics did not see themselves in the race question, and so they checked some other race. And if a person marked some other race and wrote in that they were Irish, they would be reclassified to white. But because Hispanics could be of any race, what it meant was that if they checked some other race, they remained in that. So there was a very, very, very large concentration of Hispanics in the some other race category. And so why is this a problem? Well, it's because the Census Bureau is the only agency out there which uses some other race as a category. So for, say, to calculate birth rates or incidence rates for cancer, those agencies don't have a some other race category. And so what they get from the Census Bureau for a denominator is a file in which some other race has been reallocated to another category, white, black, or something else. There were complaints about why did Asian and Pacific Islanders have so many response options and whites and African Americans had so few. So this was the data equity issue. And then of course, probably the most serious problem was, why are there two separate questions for race and ethnicity? And this is directly connected to the problem that I mentioned about some other race. So in early 2000s, there was an attempt to correct at least the some other race problem. And the Census Bureau more or less unilaterally just simply decided to eliminate the some other race category. There was some evidence to suggest that this led to higher item non-response rates among the Hispanic population. There were advocacy organizations that objected to the elimination of some other race. And eventually this led to congressional intervention, which basically mandated the Bureau to retain the some other race category. As I think Nicholas is going to say a few words about this, but in 2010, the Census Bureau began an effort to devise a better question. And this began with something called the Alternative Questionnaire Experiment, which was embedded in the 2010 census. And then over the next decade for 2020 planning, there were additional tests. And so what the Census Bureau almost used for 2020 was a modified question that basically included a combined question of Hispanic origins with race. And then it gave various individuals, various groups, the option to do additional write-ins. And then an even later version of this question, it gave respondents the option to choose Middle Eastern or North African as a response category. Was this question adopted? No. And as Nicholas is going to show you, the question remained much the same as 2010. And this was largely due to inaction on the part of the Office of Management and Budget. So with that, I'm going to stop my screen share. And thank you very much for your time and attention. I'll be happy to take questions later on in the webinar. And I'm going to turn the floor over to Nicholas.
I'm going to just jump right in here before you get there, Nicholas. I'm sorry, I'm just kind of controlling about this stuff. Matt, I want to thank you very much for taking us way back to the beginning. I do think that what we're doing in the present is always better determined when we understand the flow over the course of decades. So thank you for starting us in 1790. You've given us right up to now, you've brought us up to date on the question about whether to combine the categories of the questions. Do you want to make a comment now about where you think this whole question of race categorization for government purposes will be heading in the next, not just 10 years, but 10, 20 years? Do you want to say something about what might be coming, since we've seen so much change over the many decades so far?
Well, just quickly, we have asked race in every census since obviously 1790. I don't see it going away anytime soon by virtue of the legislation that mandates the use of the question. The Census Bureau spent enormous amounts of time, energy, and money trying to devise a better question. And I think all the evidence really pointed to the fact that that was a better question. It performed much, much better in all the testing they did between 2010 and 2020. And it really wasn't the Bureau's fault that the question wasn't included on the 2020 form. And hopefully it'll show up in 2030 because what happened to the 2020 question was really kind of an anomaly of our times. And I can go into more detail about how that happened a little later. I'd be happy to, but it's a more complicated narrative than I think is appropriate now for the moment.
Got it. Thank you very much, Matt. And now, Nicholas, we're going to come to you. I said earlier, you're the Director and Senior Advisor on Race and Ethnic Research and Outreach for the Census Bureau's Population Division. That is a mouthful. I'm sure you have a better way to express it. Tell us what you'd like us to know about yourself, including something fun.
Well, thank you, Wendy. And Matt, thanks for that great presentation and that great setup for my remarks today. I have a fun fact. I think Matt will remember this. Maybe a few others. Clark may know this as well, but prior to the 2010 census, I had a full head of curly hair. I'm not going to say what happened during 2010, but that's no longer the case. So that's my fun fact. My screen's attempting to share now. Let's see if I can make that happen. All right. Are we able to see the screen? Okay, great. So I'm very happy that Matt was able to present prior to me. He really helped to set up the context for what I'm going to talk about today. And that's the changes that were made between the 2010 census and the 2020 census. I'm going to really hope that you'll have a lot of questions about the nitty-gritty weeds and the nuts and bolts. I'm happy to go into some of those answers during the Q&A, but I hope that what I cover will really help you to understand why some data is comparable between 2010 and 2020 and why other data needs to be compared with caution. So let's go right into it. For those of you who were around in August, mid-August, we released 2 stories on the census website as part of the public law redistricting file. They give us a new snapshot of the racial and ethnic composition of the United States and also the racial and ethnic diversity. So these 2 stories are very short, clear and concise American Count stories on the web. They're basically blogs, and they help to explain that snapshot of who we are and how we're interconnected. And that's the focus I'm going to give you today for my remarks. As Matt explained, the race ethnicity question format designs for the 2020 census adhere to the 1997 standards set by the U.S. Office of Management and Budget. And you can see the slides showing these 2 questions, 2 separate questions. As Matt mentioned, while we successfully tested and really got a lot of great support for using a combined question format for 2020, we are required by the standards to use 2 separate questions for self-response. The Census Bureau is a statistical agency and not a policy agency, but our research showed and our testing and our outreach provided support for improvements that we were able to make for the 2020 question designs within the OMB guidelines. So overall, there were several significant changes that we made to the questions themselves, but perhaps more profoundly, we improved the ways that we processed and collected the data. We also improved how we coded the responses. There have been some recent commentary about this that said the Census Bureau got a better prescription for its eyeglasses to see what people were telling us about the results. And I think that kind of speaks to the way in which I would like to frame it. We have more acute details of what people are telling us in response to these two separate questions, and we're actually looking at collecting and coding all of it. We could go into details about the past during the Q&A, but these improvements enabled a more thorough and a more accurate picture of how people are self-identifying, but also some of the struggles that they're having are being magnified with those two separate question formats. So the results in a nutshell tell us that we're much more multiracial and more racially and ethnically diverse than what we measured in the past. So the first part of this measurement for improving the questions on Hispanic origin comes from our data processing and our coding procedures. We were able to make changes that allowed us to collect more characters, meaning what you wrote on the form in the past stopped at 18 characters or 30 characters in terms of our data collection. The number of groups that you reported to us that we coded prior to the 1990 census and earlier, we only coded one, as Matt explained, absent the mulatto and quadroon and octoroon categories the last century. But in 2000, we started coding multiple responses, but still not exactly everything that people were telling us. So to look at some of the results from a very high level, first we have a number of stats that I'm going to quickly zip through. The total Hispanic population we measured in 2020 was 62 million. We also found that across race and ethnicity groups, a very much prominent rise in the proportions of these groups that reported more than one race. On this slide, you can see the in combination population for the statistics in the center. We also found that while the white alone population as a category was not growing, in fact, dropped by 8%, the people who reported white in combination with another group, or the multiracial white population, actually grew by over 300%. And so looking at each of these components of what you're seeing on the screen of alone in combination and alone or in combination data, while around since Census 2000 are really more important for us to keep in mind as we talk about the context of what we're describing as a race or ethnicity group. The multiracial population was measured at 34 million people, much of this due to the increase in people reporting Hispanic origin and another race group in 2020, ultimately coded as Hispanic, meaning some other race and another race group. And then seeing some of the race alone or in combination being the second largest group ahead of the Black or African American alone or in combination population. That was something that we predicted would take place based on our research last decade if we continued using a separate question format. And in fact, it was even larger than we expected. So the next thing that I'm going to zip through are this series of bar charts where, again, we're focusing on the in combination population in the center of each major group. The in combination population was a faster grower or a much higher measure of change for every category on this census. See with the white population, as I mentioned, about 300+% reporting multiple groups, including white. And the same was true for Black, being larger than the alone population, for American Indian being larger, Asian, Native Hawaiian, you can see all of these, and particularly the some other race category being highlighted here as having tremendous growth or tremendous change in what people were reporting. Now, there have been a lot of questions about how we measure this. I want to say in a nutshell that we are measuring the concepts in the same way that we did in 2020 and in 2010 and in 2000. People may be telling us more than they did in the past, but we're more able to accurately see and code and classify that. But there may be questions about, for example, if I said that I was white and Cuban in 2010, did you code me the same way in 2020? The answer to that is yes, and I'll talk about some of the nuances with other types of reporting patterns that I'm sure may come up during the Q&A. I'll point out here the big change between 2010 and 2020 among multiracial reporting was, again, the white and some other race population, or white and Hispanic, being coded as some other race within the separate questions format. But you can see for all of the groups that were over 1 million in size for the multiracial population, they all had important changes over the decade. Now, the last thing that I'm going to cover in my remarks today, focus on, in terms of composition, focus on the use of redistricting data tables. So we know that there are data tables called P1 with just race information included. There's also a table called P2, and that focuses on Hispanic origin and race data. And this is where we take a little bit of a turn from saying that we need to look at the results comparing 2010 and 2020 with caution. And that's because when you use table P2, which has Hispanic origin as the category, and then all of the non-Hispanic race groups co-equal in that table, we have apples to apples comparisons between 2020 and 2010 that are not as impacted by the important changes that we made in our coding and in our classification. And that's because Hispanic here is treated as a co-equal category where all of the multiracial Hispanics, white Hispanics, Black Hispanics, et cetera, are in that category, Hispanic or Latino of any race. So this is important to keep in mind when we talk about our next series of slides about diversity. But just to pause here so that you have a sense of the types of changes that we saw within Hispanic race reporting in 2020 versus 2010. On the slide now, you can see on the left, Hispanic or Latino population and the reporting of white alone, for example, which went down by about 50%, Black or African American alone, which also decreased between the 10 years in terms of identification, a rise of about 100% in Hispanics identifying as American Indian and Alaska Native alone, and then the considerable increase or change in Hispanics reporting multiple groups. You can see over 500% change between 2010 and 2020. When you look at the right-hand side of the screen in terms of the non-Hispanic population, a couple of the key takeaways here are the American Indian, Alaska Native alone non-Hispanic population with virtual no change, and then the increase in some of the race that is not Hispanic, that may be people reporting either Brazilian or another group that's classified as some other race, and also the increase in the multiracial population that is not Hispanic. So I talked about the reasonable and expected distributions that we're seeing because of the improvements that we made. Again, that these results are not surprising. They align with our research that we did over the past 10 years, and they more accurately illustrate the complexities and the richness of what people are reporting within the two separate questions and the current standards. So I'm going to quickly finish up with a discussion about diversity and how we measure racial and ethnic diversity and how that is comparable in terms of these concepts that we're talking about, again, because of the cross-tabulated P2 statistics. So we had three primary measures. I can talk about some of these during Q&A if you're interested, but we released information about the diversity index, which shows that we are much more diverse than we were in terms of 10 years ago, changes that occurred for certain states being more diverse than others. You can see here on the slide, California, Nevada, Hawaii, Texas, Maryland, New Jersey, the District of Columbia, and also New York having the highest levels of diversity. And diversity as a concept, the way that we measure it is essentially thinking about two people taken at random within a geographic area who may be of a different race or ethnicity group. And so this is essentially giving you a percentage of the time in Hawaii, for example, that would be occurring 76% of the time that you're in that state. Now, the measure that I'll focus on the most here is our prevalence rankings. There's a lot of information in this graphic. I'm going to step through it pretty quickly, but essentially it's giving us a sense of all the different groups that are shown in the legend on the left, from white alone, not Hispanic, down through the total Hispanic or Latino population of any race. How often were they the first or the second or the third largest category within a state's population? And you can see that for most states in the US, the white alone non-Hispanic population shown in orange was the most prevalent group. But in several states, California, DC, Hawaii, New Mexico, and the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, another group was the largest in terms of the most prevalent. Hispanic in California, New Mexico, and Puerto Rico, as well as Black or African American in DC and Asian in Hawaii. There were also some interesting findings for the second largest group. We saw changes in the state of West Virginia, where the multiracial population became the second largest racial or ethnic group. In Wisconsin, where the Hispanic population surpassed the Black or African American population. And in Texas, where the comparisons of the first and second groups narrowed dramatically compared to 10 years ago, where the Hispanic population and the white alone non-Hispanic population are essentially both the same at about 39 or 40%. And in DC, the proportion of the Black or African American alone non-Hispanic population narrowed quite a bit and is caught up to almost by the white non-Hispanic population. So those are some quick facts. All of this information is available on our website. These are static maps and pictures that I'm showing you, but they are available in an interactive data format. You can look at them comparing 2010 and 2020 results, and you can also look at the information for your state, states across the country, as well as all the counties of the United States. So I'll stop there, Wendy, and turn it back to you, and I'm happy to talk about things in more detail during the Q&A.
Great. Thank you very much, Nicholas. A couple of takeaways for me from what you said. One is that we may not have gotten the combined question that seemed like it was on the track to being used in 2020, but we did get a lot of other changes, including a much greater ability for people to self-identify in much broader categories. So when we see the nation looking more diverse, it probably is, in fact, because we are more diverse and also because we're better able to identify it that way. So thank you very much for that. A question for you and for Matt. Are you both willing to share your slides? I'm guessing that it's a thumbs up on both. If so, send them to Christy and she'll get those posted for us. Okay, got it, great. And then we had one question that was specifically for you, Nicholas. How many federal employees in the POP division are able to read and understand the computer code which executed the 2020 census race and ethnicity data, editing, auto coding, and imputation, both assignment and allocation? I have no idea what that question means. I'm guessing you do. If you could explain to us what that meant and answer how many people understand how that works.
Okay, well, I'm not sure that I fully understand the question, but let me talk a little bit about coding and classification and what that system is. We have what's called a master file. The master file is a catalog of all the responses that people have given to us over the last several censuses, surveys like the American Community Survey, and we use that master file to match up letter for letter, character for character, to the responses that come in through the data collection process of the census. Now, here's another fun fact. Sorry, I'm going to give two so I can catch up with Matt. In 2010, we had about 35 million detailed write-ins to the race question. Remember, we only had 3 write-in areas. We had American Indian, Alaska Native, we had other Pacific Islander and other Asian, and some other race. In 2020, we had over 350 million detailed write-ins to the race and ethnicity questions. So from about 35 million people writing in detail to about 350 million people writing in detail. The fun fact about this is that we were able to code automatically through the computer programs that our staff put together 99% of those 350 million write-ins. That's making a character-to-character match for your response of Irish, German, and Cherokee, or your response of Black or African American spelled with 2 N's at the end, or Mexican, or Mexicano, or Mexican American. These are all detailed responses that we're collecting and that people are telling us. There's not really any one thing that people say gives you my full racial and ethnic identity. I want to be able to tell you that. And that's what we did through the collection of all these write-ins. So if that doesn't exactly answer the question, be happy to maybe talk offline with the person that wanted to get a little more detail about that.
Great. We might ask to put everybody's, depending on how you feel about it, your contact information in the chat box if people do want to check in. Clark, you've been patient. I'm coming to you next. Clark Bensen is a lawyer by trade and a data analyst by the actual work that he does. At least that's how I think about you, Clark. And I know you've been doing redistricting for some decades now, so you're not new to this game, not new to the census and the categories. And because we are the program for elections and redistricting, we did want to bring this home. What has the changes meant for you as a person who actually draws maps meant?
Sure, thank you.
Oh, and a fun fact, I can't forget that. You've got to give us a fun fact.
Oh, yeah. I guess my fun fact is, notwithstanding that this looks like an actual modern house, the rest of the house is 240 years old. So I live on the edge of civilization. I guess that's 2 fun facts. Okay, so yeah, as Wendy said, I've been through several cycles and with Kim Brace, who's my Democrat counterpart, as it were, and Tim Story, who preceded Wendy in her role. We were on the federal advisory panel for the 2010 census. So we've had to go through a lot of these questions before. And you know, it's great that we have all this information. It's great that we have much more information from the fill-ins and such, because I think and Nichols and I have had this conversation over the years too, which is the ancestry question, which used to be, of course, before the short form was the only thing, used to be very detailed information for those who don't fill out a race or an ethnicity question. And for the record, the reason that they are different is because there's different foundation for the inclusion of Hispanics under the Federal Voting Rights Act than there is for race categories. So they are not the same from the foundation. But anyway, as Nicholas was saying, he went over the first two tables briefly of the PL94 data. That's the redistricting data sets for those who aren't redistricting people. That's basically the data that came out a couple months ago that gives us down to the block level all the breaks of race and ethnicity. It gives us two ways: population, meaning everybody, and then just those who are over 18. Now, when I look at the table 3 and 4, which would have been the next thing that Nicholas would go over, that's where you get the voting age population breakout. If you look at the trends over the last 3 decades, or from 2000 to 2010 and 2010 to 2020, on the basis of the non-Hispanic voting age population, the changes are not as dramatic. So from a redistricting standpoint, of course, we look at both population and voting age population. So as Nicholas showed, a lot of the population numbers were staggeringly, significantly higher than they had been in 2010. They're still higher under the voting age population, but in reality, the overall trend has not changed much. Some of the race and multi-race definitely was higher. But basically what's happened for each of the last 2 decades is what we would call non-Hispanic white, or many people call Anglo, has dropped down, as he showed in his charts, about 5 percentage points from the standpoint of the entire voting age population. The Asians have increased about 1%, and the Hispanics have increased between 2 or 3% each of those 2 decades. The some other race and the multi-race combined, just as a number, has increased anywhere from 1 to 2 or 2.5% points as well. What has not really changed is the American Indians, or Pacific Islanders. Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, they're very small anyway, but they haven't changed much. And the Blacks really have not changed much either, as a proportion of the overall voting age population. So now, the reason that's important to redistricting people is because we have to also look in almost every state. Well, I'll phrase that. Section 2 of the Federal Voting Rights Act does apply to every state, but it's more important in some states than others. And we have to run analyses to determine whether, in fact, we have to draw a district to avoid a Section 2 violation. Okay. The simple explanation of the Section 2 of the Federal Voting Rights Act is, if we drew a district that had a substantial group of, let's just say, Asians in it, but it was won by someone who was not Asian, Asians might be able to sue and say, look, there were enough Asians here, not in this district, but in this district and next door, that had you put us together in our own district, we could have elected our preferred candidate choice, basically being an Asian, not always, but basically. And so therefore they might win. So what legislatures and commissions and such have to do is to proactively decide what are they going to do to avoid being sued by somebody. If they're going to lose the lawsuit, they'd rather just draw the district at the outset. Lawsuit's good policy. So to do the analyses for this, of course, we need voting age population, because what we are analyzing is the degree to which the Asians vote together for the same candidate, which is different than the candidate who won, because there are too many proponents or supporters of the candidate who won in that district. So to avoid that liability for litigation, which happens throughout the decade, as it were, if whether or not the legislature does a good job or not, they may still get sued. We have to look at all this information, which largely comes from initially tables P3 and P4 of the PL94 data. Now, I'd mentioned non-Hispanic, and this goes back to something that that Matt was talking about before. When the multi-race question was first instituted for the 2000 census, bear in mind for the 1990 census, we had 24 variables on the entire PL94 file. Every record had very minimal stuff, but it still was broken down the same 4 ways, meaning pop, pop, VAP, and VAP, whatever. But now there are like 300 in those 4 tables. So we have all these different breaks because multi-race is broken down, meaning tabulated for up to the entire 6 options you have. Well, that's cumbersome for us. And you saw Nichols had on his charts, he had like black alone or black alone or in combination. There's a middle ground in there too, which is the OMB definition or the DOJ definition. They're basically the same, which is you would take the non-Hispanic, and we use black again, you take the non-Hispanic black alone, and you would add the non-Hispanic black, white, and black together. That's not alone or in combination. In combination basically means anybody else, what we would call any part black. If you answered black for any of those race categories, you would get in there. And that's the extreme end of the number. So black alone would be the low number, in combination would be the higher number. But the point is, OMB suggests using the non-Hispanic numbers because you're not double counting people. If you add up all the non-Hispanic groups, it adds up to 100%. If you start using any part black and whatever, what happens a lot of times is you have a table that has all the race groups in there for each district. And if you add them all up, it'll be more than 100% of what the population is or the voting age population. This is a problem explaining it to a judge. Judge does understand that 100% means 100%. If you use the non-Hispanic breaks, you're much more likely to have the, wouldn't have to explain that part of it. But again, states use different things. They don't all use what OMB suggested. That the OMB DOJ stuff is what DOJ uses and used to use when they had pre-clearance. Now, right now, we don't have pre-clearance under Section 5, but HR 4 is seeking to reinstate it. So it has not gone away entirely. And again, the basic difference there is, as I said, you may have different numbers for the black percentage in a district, basically, whether it's a plaintiff, defendant, intervener, or whatever. And that's the only problem with the improved design and collection and tabulation and such, which is it's hard to actually know, meaning compare the numbers with the current plan that has not yet been adopted without doing a special analysis, which is not all that difficult. But the point is, most people will have a listing of what the demographic numbers were before from last time on the record from the 2010 cycle. And now all of a sudden they'll have different numbers. So it does make it a little murky. Just know one of those things that's kind of tricky. But another thing I want to bring up is that one of the other problems we have in doing these analyses is the lack of data that we would like to have. Asians per se, Hispanics, well, basically any race group. White, as I said, you can have ancestry, but they're not a protected class in the Voter Rights Act. Every other group is the concept of calling Asian as a group, what is that? I mean, even Mexicans are, a typical thing is Mexicans and Cubans would both be Hispanic, but of course they don't necessarily vote the same way, that stuff. And that's what we need to look at when we look at polarized voting. But the problem is we don't get that information until after the fact, when we get other tables from the Census Bureau, and then we only get it at the census tract level. So if we want to see how the Jamaicans voted versus the Puerto Ricans or something like that, which matters in some places, we really are kind of hampered to do that because we just don't have enough data at the block level to do that. And so the precision for the analyses that we need to do for that kind of stuff is sort of a problem. And of course, I've not even mentioned the term that Wendy's just waiting for me to mention, which is differential privacy, although I did see a thing in the chat about that. The basic problem we have with differential privacy for this purpose, being for analytical purposes, is that we don't have much faith that the numbers at the block level are correct, because we know they're not, but we don't even have much faith that in fact the demographic characteristics at the block level are correct. But those are the numbers we need to estimate what the demographics are for the precincts. I don't mean BTDs, I mean the precincts for previous elections. So we can do the polarized voting analysis. So I'm not bashing differential privacy per se on that. I'm just saying that that's a factor as well. It doesn't really matter so much at the higher level, like it isn't going to affect any of Nichols' charts. But in redistricting, especially at the local level, where they actually look block by block, and many Section 2 cases and districts, even at the state legislative level, where they also look block by block. That is, it's going to be a problem. I mean, it already has been to some degree. So anyway, that's my take on it. We don't have much time for, but there may be a question or two. So I'm done.
Thanks very much, Clark. My first question is, when you say there could be a problem with it, does that mean that it's likely that the quality of the data on race will end up in court somewhere?
Well, yeah,
based on
I
differential privacy or anything else?
Right, I expect it to be an issue because we'll have, I mean, a typical example is if you take a map, I mean, the block numbers changed throughout the decade. There were many fewer blocks, but anyway, you can't just do it programmatically. You take a map of the 2010 district and the 2020 district, and you shade the blocks a certain color, and then you label them with a number, and you just start looking through, and you can see there are problems. Like, you know, on west, the Indians, as it were, used to be on the west side of Main Street. Now they're all on the east side of Main Street. It's not like they're 10 miles away necessarily. Yeah. Right. It's kind of like advanced swapping. I mean, that's a term here that's not really applicable, but yes, that's kind of the thing. So therefore, when we add up the precincts, the votes are in the wrong place, which the footnote here is too, is if you're doing racial polarized voting, do not use adjusted prisoner allocation data to do your analysis, because those people did not vote.
Okay, thanks, Clark. We've got most of our questions for Nicholas, so I'm going to ask you to come back on the screen. Matt, I'm going to start with you, though. This is from Jack Shadid, excuse me. Why are people from Middle Eastern, North African, and Eastern Europeans, former Soviet countries, considered white and not part of two distinct categories? And has there been a discussion of distinguishing those Eastern and Western European ethnicities? Any thoughts about that? I know that's pretty deep.
Yeah, well, Nicholas put an answer in the chat, but just a short version of that is that when they were talking about revising the 1977 classification, that was in the early 1990s, and the Middle Eastern, North African population was relatively small. And the Department of Justice also did a review of civil rights legislation, and at that time determined that they were not subject to civil rights protections in the same way that other groups were. And so that was the reason that it was not included, basically in a nutshell. But it's a more complicated story than that.
Great. Well, that was great that you were able to give us the nutshell version. Nicholas or Matt, I don't know who'd like to respond. We've got the question about 23andMe. Are DNA tests changing the census and the way people respond to the census?
Well, I'll take a shot at that because I have a couple of colleagues that are doing work in that area, and people who do take actually my colleague Aaliyah Saperstein here at Stanford, and another colleague, Wendy Roth, who's a sociologist at Penn, have both published work showing that individuals who bother to take the DNA test do in fact report more complicated identities.
That'll be interesting as we go forward. Nicholas, Jen Vink asks, the 2020 questionnaire asked about origin. You talk about detailed race groups. Are they the same thing? And do you think answers were given as if origin was used as a detailed race category?
That's a really good question, Jan. Thank you for posing that. So we were purposeful in the terms that we used on the question design, but all of the things that we explored over the last couple of decades really showed us that these terms, origin, ethnicity, race, they mean different things to different people. They're not consistent in their meaning. And those are some of the challenges that we were trying to find ways to improve upon. For example, we removed the print origins, for example, instruction and just said print, for example, to try and detract or take away from confusing someone as to thinking, what does origin mean? But origins as a term is really rooted in the 1997 OMB standards and the 1977 standards, when we say that people with origins from Europe, the Middle East, or North Africa are this race group. And so that's also where that wording comes from. Hispanic origin also uses the word origin, but ancestry is another question. So I'm just trying to say in a very quick way that these concepts, they mean different things to different people when they respond. And a lot of our research that we did last decade tried to dig into that to see if there are better ways to approach the question designs. And one of the novel ones that we found was just to try and remove the questions or the terms altogether and just let people respond in the way that they see these categories and these options and what it means to them. But we'll hopefully have some more that we can talk about moving forward from 2020, where we start planning for the 2030 census based on our work.
I'm so struck. Oh, go ahead, Matt.
I was going to ask Nicholas the question is that given that you have all of this enormously detailed data from the question, given differential privacy and the impact on the privacy budget, do you think any of that will ever see the light of day?
I certainly hope so. We've started engaging on that work this fall. We had just in the last couple of weeks meetings with our National Advisory Committee, and we also had a American Indian tribal leader consultation that took place yesterday, where we're looking for feedback from the public on how they use detailed race ethnicity data, at what levels of geography, and also the types of specific characteristics data they need from the decennial census. Our goal was to be able to collect all of this important detail to really help with the disaggregation of data. So you may see in data sets Asian as a category, but being able to disaggregate and understand differences in populations for the Hmong or the Laotian population compared to Chinese or Japanese has been shown with data and with analysis to be very important. And that same pattern is there within all the different racial or ethnic groups. There's an interest in seeing the diversity within groups as well as diversity across groups. So I certainly hope that we're going to be able to make that happen. And we're looking for public feedback to help us make that move forward.
So I want to say that we're coming close to the hour, but I do not have to be anywhere else. Can each of you, Clark, Matt, and Nicholas, show me, are you okay to stay for an extra 5 or 10 minutes?
Sure.
Okay, great. So we're going to keep going. Now, I do feel like we've mentioned differential privacy twice. I'm going to give you the layperson's perspective on this. The Census Bureau is required to protect the privacy of the confidentiality of the responses that they get from household to household. They've always done this. They've done it with different mechanisms. This year, they're using a different mechanism than they did 10 years ago or 10 years prior to that. It adds noise. I think that's a census term. I don't think I made that up. I was using fudge until I realized you use noise. And this noise shows up more so at smaller geography and at smaller ethnic groups. And so the question is, when you're talking about those precincts that Clark talked about, or you're talking about subsets of ethnic groups down to smaller units, there could be more noise. And the question is whether it matters or not. Matt, question for you. I'm curious if there is any guidance for survey makers to include Hispanic/Latinx as a race category within the next 10 years, as we anticipate the changes that were almost made in the 2020 census to be made in 2030? I love that question because it's not about what does the Census Bureau do or what OMB says, it's what all of the policymakers and all of the thinkers in our nation are doing on race categories.
Yeah, the question that the Census Bureau devised over the decade of 2010 to 2020 is a better question. And so if I was a survey researcher and I wanted to use a good question, I'd use that one. And it may turn out to be by 2030, the Bureau will catch up to the survey research community if they decide to adopt that en masse.
Great, thank you. Now, when we close out, I'm going to ask each of the three of you if you have any advice for the Census Bureau. Nicholas, you are in the Census Bureau, and I'm sure it's the most perfect of all places, so you won't have any advice for the Census Bureau. The others might, and everybody could have some advice for states as they use this data, so just be prepared for that. My colleague from NCSL asks, can you speak more to the race and ethnicity of our children under age 18 or under 6? And I think that's for you, Nicholas.
Sure. We did detail some initial findings in our America Count story, and I can put that link into the chat, where when you take the PL tables, P1 and P3, and subtract them from one another, you get the pop under 18. And so that's available in tabulations to look at your state or your geography to learn more about it. But in a nutshell, the diversity of the youth population is even more apparent than the diversity of the population over 18. The multiracial population is much larger proportionally, et cetera. So the ways that we've talked about it, it's really kind of giving you a glimpse of the next generations moving forward that are more diverse and more multiracial than previous generations. I don't think that's a surprising trend, as Clark mentioned, and as Matt has mentioned. We're looking at data that's been collected over time, so these trends are not very surprising that as we move forward, we're seeing that. I'll put that into the chat.
Oh, good. I appreciate that. And then we have two more questions for you, Nicholas, from Hansi Luang at NPR. I'm going to just read them. You'll understand them better than I do. How does the Census Bureau determine which types of write-in responses to the race question are coded as some other race versus categorized as uncodable? Let's stop there.
Okay. So for that first one, I didn't mention this, but there are things that people tell us that are uncodable. And what we do to determine that is whether we can see within the OMB standards if this is pertaining to a particular nationality or ethnic group that we would see as fitting within one of those particular categories. So if someone told us that they were German or Germanic or Deutschland or Germaner or Berliner, we're looking at what does that response really signify for us. It's telling us an origin of Germany, which according to the OMB standards is European and therefore white. So we make that determination. But if someone tells us they're from Mars, which some people do, that doesn't fit into the standards according to the way that they're written. So that would be an example of an uncodable response. Or someone's telling us, just their name. They put it in the wrong line. It's therefore not a race group. So there are things that are uncodable. But for the most part, and this is detailed in our race ethnicity code list, which is part of the public law documentation that's available on the website, you can see the thousands of unique responses that are coded and classified within the OMB standards, as well as the ones that are included in some of the race. So a couple prominent groups that are not Hispanic or Latino groups in SOR include Brazilian, Cabo Verde, and other groups that really don't have a specific definition pointed out within the OMB standards because they don't speak to the entire globe.
And we have the question about Ashkenazi. If somebody writes that in, how do you categorize that?
I would have to double check that one, but I believe it's coded within the white racial category. I can follow up with that if that person wanted to reach out to me to give you that. But that brings up the question of how are religious responses handled? And that's also something that people may be curious to see. We don't code and tabulate religious responses per se, but we have a unique complexity with ethno-religious responses. And one of the most prominent ones that we talked about around the 2020 census was the coding and the classification of SIK, S-I-K-H, as a group that would be within the detailed Asian category moving forward. And so there's a lot of great questions about, every particular identity that people may have and how that's coded and classified. You can find that in our coding and classification list that's available online.
Great. Okay, I think it's time then to ask you each this question about policy options that you might have both for the Census Bureau and for states as they work with data. So Clark, I'm going to come to you first. Have you got something in mind that you wish either of those two groups would do, or one for each?
Well, ancestry is the key word here. And as I said, Nicholas and I have had a debate about this over time too. Again, we used to have ancestry data, like say, quintessential German, Norwegian, French, or whatever. They don't fit anywhere in the race categories. I mean, again, now, and maybe they did people coded that in under white this time too, because there wasn't any ancestry question, because the short form's all they have. But from a redistricting standpoint, it would be nice to have that kind of information, because there's been a lot of focus lately on communities of interest. Well, I can think of that as being a very common community of interest, but we don't have any information to do that. And certainly at any reasonable level to use for redistricting. And that goes back to my whole point about the Jamaicans or whatever. We just don't have very low level data for anything that's useful aside from the race stuff. And that is a frustration when we try and do districts, because we just don't have anything else to look at. It's kind of like when we talk about differential privacy, everybody's always talking about the income or all this other, socio-demographic stuff. We don't have that information. We don't use that information except at a very high level. But if you're drawing districts, it's a perfectly valid thing to look at, because it just makes sense. That's what people on the ground, if there's a strong Irish neighborhood or something, they expect it to be kept together. We don't know where they live, because we don't have that information at that level.
All right,
Wendy,
thank
could I
you.
ask a follow-up
Yes.
to that for Clark?
Yes, please.
So Clark, I just wanted to understand if you were recommending that data on detailed disaggregated race and ethnicity groups would be part of the PL release as opposed to coming out later?
Oh, well, definitely. Oh, yeah. If it was part of, we used to get it on the SF1, but again, it was late. And this time, again, it will be like, even when we get it, it'll be track level. But I mean, this is the one advantage of having had the long form, which was, it was a very good survey. It covered a lot. It had a good sample rate. It wasn't current, but those kinds of areas don't change much. Eventually they will and all that kind of stuff. So we used to have useful information. We've lost that now because of the ACS. Just not available at a level we can use.
So Nicholas, I am going to come to you and ask if you have any advice for the states. And if you don't have any advice, I'm going to offer you some advice we could offer to the states, but your turn first.
Sure. I mean, I'm a researcher, and I think one of the things that I really like to impart when I talk about the data and the results is really to understand the entire breadth and complexity of the data, and not just to think that there's one number that can speak to what you might be interested in. So that's why I pointed out in the presentation how much we're seeing this diversity and complexity of race ethnicity information, but not to be scared by it either. There are ways that you can take the alone and the owner and combination numbers and know that for the white population or the Black population, it's not a very large proportion. But if you were to look at American Indians or Pacific Islanders, for example, you'd miss half the story. That's something that's very important when we look at the data to understand how we can get a perspective on who people are and where they are based on those minimum and maximum numbers. I think also the big key is understanding how states can use both P1 and P2 for their information and understanding about the race ethnicity composition of the country. You really don't know anything with P1 about Hispanics at all. Right. But P2 tells you a different perspective, which is the groups co-equal and almost like a combined question format in that you're looking at all of them together. So it's important to look at all the data. That would be my advice to really get a good understanding of your state and your localities.
That's perfect. What I'd say to everybody who's online is you all have a state demographer, and that person can help you do this. There are people out there who know exactly what's in that data and where to find it. Matt, I'm coming back to you for the final word. Any advice for the Census Bureau or for states as they work with this data?
Well, for the Census Bureau, and this isn't really for Nicholas, but for the Bureau's leadership, is that they need to think very, very carefully about the disclosure avoidance system that they've implemented for 2020, and that it's, the bugs they're not fixed. And for the states, I would say look at your data carefully, and if it looks askew, it probably is askew, and differential privacy is probably the source.
Well, thank you, Matt, for that, and Clark and Nicholas, all of you for being here today. My thought is that this is sort of the start of a conversation. I will say that if you are in a small municipality that thinks that your numbers aren't right, there is something called the count question resolution process, that can be undertaken. We may have a webinar on that some other day. But in the meantime, you at least know how to reach one person at the Census Bureau who's happy to help unravel or weave back together the kinds of questions we've had today. So with that, thanks all for being here. It's been a real treat. Clark, Matt, and Nicholas, just stay on for a minute, and bye-bye, everybody else.
Thank you.
Okay, great, thanks.